thought Mischief Night was just an excuse to pull harmless pranks, nothing more than egging houses, toilet papering trees, or ringing doorbells and running away. It was all supposed to be in good fun, a tradition that allowed us to break the rules just a little bit, to feel rebellious before returning to the mundane reality of school and curfews the next day. Mischief Night was our one night of freedom, but that year, everything changed. I never imagined it could take such a dark turn. It started like any other Mischief Night. A group of us, Tommy, Sarah, Mike, and me, gathered at the end of our block as dusk settled over the neighborhood. We were giddy with anticipation, our backpacks stuffed with supplies, eggs, toilet paper, shaving cream, and a few other items that seemed essential for our night of pranks. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement, and in those shadows, our mischief was born. Tommy had the brilliant idea to target Mrs. Dawson, the neighborhood recluse. She lived in a dilapidated old house at the far end of the street, where the sidewalk ended and the woods began. Mrs. Dawson never gave out candy on Halloween, and she always seemed to glare at the kids who walked by her house, her sharp eyes tracking them from behind her dusty curtains. Rumor had it that she was a witch, though most of us didn't really believe it. Still, something about her made our skin crawl. That night, the idea of targeting her house felt like the ultimate prank. Harmless, of course, just a little egging, maybe some toilet paper tossed into a gnarled oak tree. We laughed and joked as we made our way toward her house, our footsteps echoing eerily in the quiet. The rest of the neighborhood seemed to be alive with Mischief Night energy. Kids ran from house to house, pranksters plotted in hushed whispers, and every so often, the sound of a distant scream of laughter echoed through the air. As we approached Mrs. Dawson's yard, however, the mood shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, despite the mild October evening, and a strange, suffocating pressure settled over us. The leaves on the trees rustled, as if something unseen was moving through them, something that wasn't the wind. I glanced at my friends, and for a brief moment, I considered suggesting we go somewhere else. But that would have made me the coward, and none of us wanted to be the one to back out. We crossed the threshold of her yard, and that was when I felt it. A chill, a deep, penetrating cold that gnawed at my bones. The grass under my feet felt damp, almost as if the ground itself was pulsing with an unnatural energy. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to nerves. After all, we were just about to prank an old woman. What was there to be afraid of? We scattered, taking our positions. Tommy pulled out the eggs. Sarah and Mike readied the rolls of toilet paper, and I grabbed the can of shaving cream. As we began our mischief, laughter filled the air. Eggs splattered against the old, chipped windows, yolk running down the glass in thick, slimy streaks. Toilet paper soared into the air, catching in the branches of the gnarled oak tree like ghostly streamers. It was all going according to plan, until I saw her, standing in the window. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was Mrs. Dawson, but something about her was wrong. Her eyes were wide, far too wide, bulging unnaturally from her gaunt face. Her lips were pulled back in a grin so twisted, so unnatural, that it made my stomach churn. Her teeth, yellowed and jagged, gleamed in the dim light as she stared directly at me, as if she could see straight through me. I nudged Tommy, but when I looked back, she was gone. Just like that, the window was empty, the curtains still, as if nothing had ever been there. A nervous laugh escaped my throat, but my hands trembled. We all froze for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you see that?" I whispered, but no one answered. Instead, We grabbed our things and bolted, running down the street, laughing, though this time it wasn't the kind of laughter that felt fun. It was nervous, forced, the kind of laughter you use to cover up the creeping dread that slithers into your chest. As we rounded the corner, away from Mrs. Dawson's house, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but no matter how far we ran, that sensation clung to me, like invisible eyes boring into the back of my skull. The night continued with more pranks, more laughter, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment at her window. Later that night, when I finally got home, things took a darker turn. I had just kicked off my shoes when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I figured it was one of my friends playing a joke, so I ignored it. But the messages kept coming, one after the other, each more disturbing than the last. "You think it's funny?" I stared at the screen, confused. Was this one of my friends? I shot them a group message, but no one replied. I convinced myself it was just a prank, probably Sarah or Mike trying to freak me out. But the next message sent a chill down my spine. "Your turn." The air in my room seemed to grow colder, and my hands shook as I typed out a response, asking who it was. No reply, just another message. "Look outside." I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. When I pulled back the curtain, the breath caught in my throat. My house had been covered in eggs, toilet paper, and something else, something far worse. Dark streaks of blood ran down the front door, pooling at the steps. The smell hit me then, a rancid stench that made my stomach churn. It was the smell of rot, of death. I stumbled back from the window, panic rising in my chest. My mind raced. Was this another prank? But how could it be? Who would do this? I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, the power went out. The entire house plunged into darkness. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the house. I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in my nightstand. The beam flickered to life, casting eerie shadows on the walls as I crept toward the sound. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of rotten eggs and something metallic, like blood. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper, every step feeling like it could be my last. As I reached the living room, the sound of breathing grew louder, more labored. I swung the flashlight towards the corner, and there, standing in the dark, was Mrs. Dawson. Her grin was impossibly wide now, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "You thought you could get away with it?" she whispered, her voice a low, guttural rasp that sent shivers down my spine. Her mouth twitched, her lips curling into a grotesque smile that stretched too far, as if her skin were about to tear apart. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sight of her. Her hands, cold as death, reached out toward me, and I could feel the life draining from my body as her fingers wrapped around my throat. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of her laughter, deep, hollow, echoing in the darkness, as if it were coming from the very depths of the earth. Now, I'm trapped in my own home, a prisoner of that cursed night. And every year on Mischief Night, I hear her voice again, whispering, taunting, reminding me that she's still here, still watching, still waiting.
It was the night before Halloween, and Mischief Night was in full swing. The air was thick with the anticipation of pranks. the scent of leaves decaying underfoot, and the distant echoes of kids laughing and running through the streets. For years, Mischief Night had been our way of marking the transition into Halloween, a night where the rules bent just enough to let us indulge in harmless fun. But this year, something felt different. My friends and I had heard about this old, abandoned cornfield just outside of town, a place that had been the subject of countless local legends. Rumour had it that the field was haunted, that strange things happened to those who dared to trespass, but we didn't believe in that stuff. We were 16, too old to be scared of ghost stories. Besides, what better place to pull some pranks than a creepy, deserted field? The moment we arrived, though, I felt it. A shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, the kind of feeling you don't talk about because it sounds too ridiculous to put into words. The wind, which had been blowing steadily during our walk, seemed to die as soon as we stepped onto the dirt path leading to the field. The tall stalks of corn loomed in front of us like an impenetrable wall, their dark silhouettes blending into the horizon. The sky, normally lit by the faint glow of the moon, seemed darker than usual, as if the stars had retreated and left us alone in the void. But we were determined to have our fun. There was a certain thrill in testing the limits of fear, in proving to ourselves that we were braver than the stories made us out to be. We started messing around as soon as we reached the clearing in the middle of the field. Tommy was the first to grab a dried corn cob from the ground, lobbing it at Sarah with a mischievous grin. She shrieked, ducking just in time as the cob sailed past her and hit Mike instead. Laughter erupted from all of us, the sound bouncing off the empty field in a way that felt strange. The echo seemed too sharp, too immediate, as if the field itself was swallowing the noise and spitting it back out. The sky above us felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on our shoulders, and the wind that had died earlier still hadn't returned. I glanced around, taking in the seemingly endless rows of corn that stretched out on all sides, their dry leaves rustling faintly. For a moment I could have sworn I saw the stalks swaying, but the wind was still dead. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was Mischief Night. We were supposed to be scared. That was the point, right? But then we heard it. A sound that didn't belong to us. It came from deep within the cornfield. A soft but deliberate rustling. At first, we all froze, glancing at each other, our expressions shifting from playful to uneasy. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden silence that had fallen between us. "Probably just the wind," Tommy said, though he didn't sound convinced. The wind, I thought. There was no wind. Still, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a deer or some stray dog rummaging through the corn. But the sound continued, steady and purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't erratic like an animal's movement. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I swallowed hard, my heart picking up speed as the noise grew closer, the rustling of the dry corn stalks, sounding almost like footsteps. It wasn't the wind. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound brave. The words seemed to disappear into the dark, swallowed by the vastness of the field. No response, just a more rustling, closer now. I could feel the tension radiating off my friends, their breaths shallow, eyes darting toward the sound. I fumbled for my phone, the light from the screen casting an eerie glow on our faces as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but barely. The light was swallowed by the night almost as soon as it left my phone, barely illuminating the cornstalks closest to us. But it was enough to see the way they swayed unnaturally, parting slowly as if something or someone was moving through them. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. But before any of us could take a step, a figure emerged from the corn. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and spindly, unnaturally thin like the frame of some grotesque scarecrow brought to life. Its movements were slow, almost methodical, as it stepped out from between the corn rows, but it wasn't until the figure stepped fully into view that I saw its face, or rather the lack of one. Its head was covered by a twisted burlap sack. The material stretched tightly over its misshapen skull. The eyes, if you could call them that, were nothing but hollow black pits, devoid of life, yet they seemed to pull in the light from my flashlight, absorbing it like some kind of black hole. The mouth, sewn shut with thick, rotting thread, twisted into an expression that could have been a grin or a snarl. It was impossible to tell. We stood there, frozen, our breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at us with those hollow eyes. And then, slowly, it raised one long, bony arm, its fingers twisted and gnarled like the branches of a dead tree. It pointed directly at me. My heart stopped. That was all it took. The fear that had been bubbling under the surface exploded, and without thinking, we ran. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of that field, away from whatever that thing was. The sound of rustling followed us, that same steady, deliberate noise as if it was matching our every step. I could hear Sarah sobbing behind me, her breath hitching in panicked gasps, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing that thing behind us gaining on us was too much. We sprinted through the rows of corn, the stalks whipping against our arms and legs, cutting into our skin as we pushed forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the edge of the field, stumbling onto the dirt path that led back to town. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, our bodies trembling with fear. I dared to look back, my heart pounding in my chest, but the figure was gone. The field stood still, silent as if nothing had ever been there. We didn't say a word as we made our way back home. The walk was silent, each of us too shaken to speak, too terrified to process what had just happened. When I finally got home, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted and jittery. I was about to climb into bed when I noticed something on my doorstep. A single corn husk, stained with blood. I stood there, staring at it, my mind racing. How had it gotten there? Who or what had left it? I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Eventually, I forced myself to pick it up, the dried husk crackling in my hands. The blood was still wet, smearing across my fingers as I clutched it tightly, my heart pounding in my ears. I haven't been back to that field since, but every year on Mischief Night, just as the sun sets and the night grows quiet, I hear it again. The rustling, the steady, deliberate sound of something moving through the corn. I know it's waiting for me.
Mischief Night has always been one of my favorite nights of the year. There's something intoxicating about it, an unspoken rule that for just one night, chaos reigns. The pranks, the adrenaline, the sense of freedom, it all felt like a secret ritual we shared with the shadows. The anticipation would build in the days leading up to it, and by the time the night arrived, my friends and I were more than ready to unleash our mischief on the unsuspecting town. But last year, everything changed. It was supposed to be a typical Mischief Night. I met up with my friends, Tommy, Sarah, and Mike, at our usual spot by the old park, our backpacks loaded with eggs, toilet paper, and shaving cream. The streets were quiet, the sky was overcast, and the air smelled of damp leaves and smoke from distant bonfires. There was a slight chill in the air, the kind that sinks into your skin and makes you feel alive. Mischief Night had a way of making everything seem more intense. The laughter louder, the pranks bolder, the night darker. It was perfect. We started with the usual rounds, egging a few houses, tipping over trash cans, and ringing doorbells before sprinting off into the night. Our laughter echoed down the empty streets, a sound that felt both playful and defiant. We were kings of the night, free to break rules under the cover of darkness, knowing that come morning, the evidence of our pranks would be nothing but a memory. But then, we came across the old abandoned house at the edge of town. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about the house. It had stood there for decades, slowly decaying, forgotten by time. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in places, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds and dead trees. Most people stayed away from it, especially on nights like this, when the shadows seemed to cling to its crumbling walls. There were stories, of course, whispers of strange sounds, of lights flickering in the windows, of things seen in the corner of your eye that vanished when you turned your head. We'd never paid much attention to the stories. It was just an old house, a relic of a forgotten past. But that night, something about it felt different. The air around it was colder, heavier, like the house itself was alive, breathing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The streetlights that lined the road seemed to flicker as we approached, casting long, shifting shadows over the pavement. I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. It was Mischief Night, and nothing was going to scare us. Tommy was the one who dared me. "I bet you won't go inside," he said, his voice teasing but with a sharp edge to it. I wasn't about to back down. We had always been competitive like that, daring each other to do the things no one else would. It was a way of proving ourselves, of showing we weren't afraid. But that night, standing in front of that house, something about the dare felt different. I tried to laugh it off, but as I stared at the house, I felt a deep, primal fear gnawing at me. The front door was hanging on its hinges, swaying gently in the breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. The windows were dark, empty, like gaping mouths waiting to swallow anyone who dared to step inside. I could feel the weight of my friend's eyes on me, waiting for my next move, and before I could second-guess myself, I nodded. "Fine, I'll do it," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Armed with nothing but the weak glow of my phone's flashlight, I stepped toward the house. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, groaning like something alive, warning me to turn back. But I pressed on, gripping the handle of the door and pushing it open. The sound it made, a long, slow creak, echoed through the empty house, like the last breath of a dying thing. The moment I crossed the threshold, I knew something was wrong. A wave of nausea hit me, so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. The air inside was thick, oppressive, and smelled of rot, like something had died in there long ago and was slowly decomposing in the damp, dark corners. I gagged, covering my mouth as I forced myself to move deeper into the house. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the sound was being swallowed up by the darkness around me. I swept the flashlight across the room, and what I saw only made the feeling of dread intensify. The house was a wreck, broken furniture strewn across the floor, wallpaper peeling off in long, curling strips, and strange symbols scrawled in dark, jagged lines on the walls. They looked like they had been scratched into the plaster with something sharp, something desperate. I tried not to think about it, telling myself it was just the work of vandals, kids like us messing around. But the deeper I went, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. The air grew colder with each step, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, even though it was still October. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, until it was all I could hear. The house seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing thicker, darker. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I kept going, drawn by some invisible force. And then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my flashlight. But no, he was real. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, tall and dark, too tall, too dark. It was like a shadow detached from anything human, standing there, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then it moved. It didn't walk. No, it glided, silently, effortlessly, toward me. The closer it got, the colder the air became, until I could feel the frost biting at my skin. My breath came out in short, panicked gasps, fogging up the air in front of me. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen in place by fear. The shadow man stopped just inches away from me, and I could feel it, his presence, cold and malevolent, staring into me, through me, as if it could see my every thought, my every fear. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but my throat was tight, the sound trapped inside me. Then it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The voice. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound, like nails on a chalkboard, scraping at the inside of my skull, making my vision blur with pain. It was a sound that didn't belong to this world, something ancient, something wrong. I could feel my mind unraveling, my thoughts slipping away as the shadow man's words echoed in my head. Somehow, I managed to turn and run. My legs were heavy, like I was moving through water, every step a struggle. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. My friends were waiting for me, laughing, teasing, but their voices sounded distant, like they were coming from far away. I didn't tell them what I saw. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the shadow man, standing there at the end of the hallway, his dark, featureless face staring, watching, waiting. I could feel him, even in the safety of my bed, his presence lingering like a cold breath on the back of my neck. And every year on Mischief Night, he returns. I see him in the corner of my room, just standing there, silent, waiting. I don't know what he wants, but I know one thing for sure. One day, he'll come for me.